My name is Parke Wilde. I'm a professor at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University. I'm curious about how the economics of federal nutrition assistance programs work, like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program and the WIC program for women, infants, and children.
And particularly right now for the holidays, in general, many different holidays, not only Christmas. This is a particularly maybe sensitive time. And you have mentioned that in an article that there might be even more food insecurity or scarcity for many families this year. Can you tell me more about that?
It's true. This is, in a way, a very unusual and a very tough year. The food price inflation has picked up a little compared to the year before. We had a boost in food price inflation after COVID, and then it had subsided a little. But then this year, it's not as high as it was in the worst recent years, but it's been back up again a little. Usually, I tell people that households that participate in the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, the country's biggest anti-hunger program, are usually a little bit comparatively protected just because that program has an increase in what their benefits are each year based on food price inflation. And so this year is very unusual because there's cuts in the SNAP program as part of the Big Beautiful Bill Act. And then at the same time, there was the very hard implications of the government shutdown. So it meant that people had their benefits stalled. So I think for households with less income trying to use their SNAP benefits in the grocery store, it's a fairly anxious holiday season.
What would a family receive in SNAP benefits? And how can that be helpful during the holidays?
Thanksgiving dinners are by tradition a time of splurging a little, but even splurging if it's home cooking rather than an expensive restaurant meal, even this comes close to being able to fit within a SNAP budget. Sometimes charitable and emergency food assistance organizations, food banks and food pantries sometimes make an extra effort to distribute, for example, at least the turkey, and so that helps close the gap a little. But the SNAP benefit is considered to be enough for a minimally adequate but healthy diet. So the government puts a good deal of effort into developing a model diet, and nobody has to follow this model diet. The model diet is just for purposes of figuring out what the maximum benefit ought to be.
What does food insecurity look like inside of households during the holidays?
So, different people could think of what it means to them in different ways. What is the social problem of hunger and what is food insecurity? The way the federal government measures it, it uses a set of questions, about 10 questions that have to do with anybody in the household and another 8 questions for children in the household. And I find these questions quite meaningful. I think it means something to me that the government cares enough about how people are doing to ask these questions. I once listened in on earphones at the call center where people place the calls to randomly sampled households. And it asked questions like, were you worried about not having enough food because you didn't have resources? Or did the food not last? Or did you have trouble affording a balanced meal? Or did you cut or skip meals? And I think each of these questions are sort of about experiences that we can relate to. During this unusual November, when there was sort of a hiccup in distribution of the SNAP benefits, one of the things I was most curious about is the next time they measure food insecurity, usually it's scheduled for December. What is it going to tell about this particular month? Would we see a bump, for example? But unfortunately, that national survey has been canceled. They've decided not to collect that data anymore. And so this December, usually it's collected as part of the current population survey each December. That's the same survey that's used to give us our poverty rate or our unemployment rate. But this year we won't quite know. So we'll be making some guesses about it, probably based on future data.
Are there other organizations or institutes that are collecting some data to be able to get an idea of what is the status of food insecurity?
Yes, charitable organizations such as connected with Feeding America, the sort of umbrella organization for a lot of the food banks, do have a program called Map the Meal Gap traditionally used the same federal government data, but I think people connected with that program have given some thought to how they might make do with other sources in the interim.
You know, people sometimes have an image of food scarcity in their minds, or that may not be representative of the problem that really exists. And so I was wondering if you could tell me about kind of what are those statistics from the past. If we're not going to have them moving forward, what are some of the statistics on the types of people and the situations that are involved in food scarcity?
That's a great way to put the question. It's nice that you're sort of reflecting on what was the history of measurement. In other words, during this year where we won't be using the same survey, it's good to think about, well, before we had this survey, what did we do? And you have to remember all the way back to the 80s. So in the 80s, they had a mix of data sources, none of which were found to be really satisfactory, but each of them gave a different slice of the picture. For example, you can take anthropometric measurements, like measurement about how many people are wasting away, have low weight for their height, for example, which is something that you see in famines. But in the United States, the statistics on that are very, very low, so low that it wouldn't show up as a major social problem. And for exactly that reason, back in the 1980s, people thought to themselves, we're seeing a good deal of hunger around us, and the statistics say it's right there at zero. And so the question is, what's wrong with our measure that's not quite capturing the way hunger works in the United States? And so then other measures they had were how many people are in the line at the food pantry or the food bank. But that one also is a little strange because it mixes supply and demand, right? Like how many people are in the line at the food pantry partly depends on how many food pantries there are. And then it also partly depends on how hungry people are. And so I think that when they established the current survey-based measure, I think that was addressing a good deal of these problems. And so we'll probably be back to some mix.
And what about statistics about ages of people who are affected by food scarcity or their employment situation? Are many of them employed and not making enough money? Are they mostly children? Are they mostly older adults that are not able to work? Are they handicapped in some way? What does this look like in terms of the data?
A large fraction of SNAP participants in the households that are eligible are children. I think in the neighborhood of 50%. And a good deal of households have either an elderly person or a disabled person in the household. What triggers the eligibility rules doesn't have to do with whether every member is elderly, but whether a household has an elderly or a disabled person. And then for the households that don't have a child and don't have an elderly or disabled person in them, they're subject to work requirements. And so I think most of these households, everybody wants to be working if they can. So I think most of these households would be working in any case. But the program has a series of policy instruments in it that are designed to make sure that nobody's free riding. And so those came out of political compromises between liberals and conservatives over the years. And so the way those work is if you're one of those households, you have to meet a work requirement, or if you don't, you're subject to a time limit of, I think it's 3 months out of every 3 years.
At this time of the year, many people think about how to help with food and by volunteering or giving extra food to food kitchens. But it seems like they're often filled in their capacity. There isn't room or they don't need any more. What are the best ways that people can help their community with this issue of food scarcity, and maybe particularly this year?
I think that volunteering with a food bank or a food pantry is just an excellent thing to do. I think of that as like a gateway to social action. So it's often where people take their first step towards thinking about, hey, how as Americans with kind of a proud sense of the capacity of our country to provide enough resources for all of its community members, that's a good entry into that line of work. And sometimes what they need is food, sometimes what they need is volunteers. But like you said, sometimes they're at capacity for both of those. And what they really need is money. So the third thing that you could consider is donating money to those. But in addition, let me say, I think that sometimes in this country, we treat food as a worthy household need. And we think of all the other things that a household actually needs, including families with children or with elderly members or with disabled members. And we think of those as not nearly as worthy needs. Well, I encourage us to think about the whole person. And so sometimes, in addition to the care that you take with the donations that you make to food banks and food pantries, think about housing and homelessness organizations. Think about anti-poverty organizations, social justice organizations. Some of these also may be worth your consideration.
Are there certain organizations that you think are most helpful for this either holistic issue or the food scarcity issue?
For food assistance organizations, checking out organizations that are part of the Feeding America network is a great place to start. For national anti-poverty organizations, you could think of the Food Research and Action Center or the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. If your interest is in nutrition and health, you could think about the Center for Science and the Public Interest.
Are there other times of the year that food scarcity is greater than this moment?
I think that people think about it most in November, December, but no, it's with us all year. And I think it's good to make a mental note, just like for a spirit of Thanksgiving. It's good from time to time in May or July to say to yourself, "Hey, what do I have to be thankful for?" The same is true with Christmas themes. Who should I give a gift to this May? The same is true for hunger. Thinking about how people are doing in the community around us is something that we can do any time of year.
So, are you working on any research right now?
My interest is as a teacher and a citizen, but some of it is related to my technical work. For example, is on the thrifty food plan, the model diet that's used to set the maximum SNAP benefit. This has some things that are out of policy interest because it's used in this important policy use. It's a big ticket dollar item in terms of policy uses, but it also, to me, shows something insightful about the trade-offs between the different food options in the supermarkets and the retailers around us, having to do with how healthy are the foods, how much do they cost, and how desirable are they? What's interesting to me about this thrifty food plan that I do research on is that it balances all three of those considerations in a way that I think is educational about the food retail environment around us.
What is the thrifty food plan?
It's like a mathematical model. It's all of a sudden nobody listening is going to care about it anymore if I say it like that. But what they do is they try to find a model diet, sort of a bundle of foods that you could buy in grocery stores that's not too different from current consumption. So the idea is they've given some thought to not wanting it to be something only a dietitian could love, just packed to the brim with lentils. No, instead, it's supposed to be something reasonably close to current consumption, but it has to be different enough from current consumption to meet a cost constraint and to be healthy. So, current diets for Americans are not consistently healthy. And so I think that it has to be different enough to meet those nutrition guidelines. And you put that into a computer, and the computer will tell you what model diet best meets that. Of course, they don't just take what the computer spits out completely as gospel. Then they give it a little thought and think about whether that's something that somebody could actually buy and like and prepare in a grocery store.
So, if there is a mother with one child and she is out of work, what would you say that she would receive as a SNAP benefit? What's the dollar value that that person might receive?
Monthly amount is below what the average American household spends on groceries. And so it's not an overly generous amount. But it's also not rock bottom either, right? It's not a starvation diet that lets you just eat the starchy staple. Very low income people around the world eat only a starchy staple. Like first thing is, the worst off people around the world are going hungry. They're actually not getting enough calories. But all over the world, once you're out of concrete hunger, Around the world, there's many, many millions of people who just eat mainly a starchy staple. And as your income increases, you start to add more and more better things: fruits, vegetables, meats, animal foods, cheeses, dairy foods. All of these things start to get added to the diet. And so the Thrifty Food Plan is neither generous nor is it rock bottom, just a starchy staple. It's something in between.
How did you decide to study this and to study the economies of food insecurity?
Hartley, of course, always wants to say, well, clearly because that's the most important topic. But in fact, there's a history that has to do with a professor when I was an undergraduate who was a specialist in food policy topics and was especially good at nurturing the careers of students, helping them find internships that get them started on a career path. And I've reflected on that curiosity ever since, that I ended up in this field of study just because of a personal connection, almost more than only being about the merit and value of the research topic. As I think about my own role as a teacher and a mentor to students at Tufts University.
What would be the change you would most want to make if you could choose one thing in this area?
You know, I'm reflecting on the divisions of our time, right? Our country is going through a somewhat stressful time, and we're feeling a lot of divisions. And so I think the one thing that comes to mind in answer to your questions is a bit of a recovery of the sense of common purpose. I feel that it used to be that both Democrats and Republicans, both liberals and conservatives, had a strong sense of purpose and goal orientation about having fewer people be food insecure and hungry in the United States. And there were political differences. I think some people wanted safety net programs to be the solution, and other people wanted low-income workers to get a good wage in the great American capitalist workplace. And I sort of, reflecting back on it, wish for any of the above. Anybody who still has a strong sense of purpose about helping us bring prosperity to even the least of these is satisfactory to me at these times. And so maybe if I wished for one thing, it would be a recovery of that kind of patriotic sense of shared purpose.
It's hard to think about kind of how to be positive when you're talking about food insecurity, but is there something that you can mention that is kind of a positive outlook that you have, something that you're happy to see, something that looks like it's a good sign?
I think even in these stressful times, we do still have a nutrition-related safety net. There's things about it that are very well designed. For example, the program benefits don't have to get decided by Congress every year, but instead go up and down automatically with the business cycle. So if more people are unemployed, more people have low income, more people are eligible for the SNAP program, and then those benefits are made available. And so there's, even though the whole system is currently under strain, there's sort of reliable, well-designed aspects to it that are worth appreciating, even in these times.
Thank you so much for sharing your perspective and your knowledge.
Curious by Nature is a production of Newswise. More than 7,000 journalists get the Newswise wires. Visit newswise.com and find out how to spread your news today.